Everyone is wrong about the greatest engineering achievement in human history. The mission that put boots on the lunar surface wasn't just an American triumph of ingenuity and determination. It was made possible by a group of German rocket scientists, many of whom had built weapons of mass destruction for Adolf Hitler, who were secretly brought to America and embedded into the highest levels of the space program. The man who became the public face of America's space ambitions, who appeared on television screens across the nation explaining how rockets worked and why we needed to go to the moon, he wore a Nazi uniform during World War II. That might sound like some wild conspiracy theory, but the truth is often stranger and more uncomfortable than fiction. The story of how America reached the moon is inseparable from the story of Nazi Germany's rocket program. And at the center of it all was a brilliant, ambitious, and deeply compromised man whose obsession with spaceflight would cost thousands of lives before it ever saved one. Germany, at the turn of the 20th century, was experiencing a golden age of scientific innovation. Universities in Berlin, Munich, and Göttingen were producing groundbreaking work in physics, chemistry, and engineering. German scientists were at the forefront of discovering the fundamental laws of the universe, from quantum mechanics to relativity. It was a place where bold ideas flourished and where young minds were encouraged to push the boundaries of what seemed possible. But beneath this intellectual renaissance, darker forces were gathering. The Treaty of Versailles had left Germany humiliated and economically devastated after World War I. Hyperinflation destroyed life savings. Unemployment ravaged families. Political extremism on both the left and right created violent street battles. The Weimar Republic, Germany's fragile democracy, was being torn apart from within. And in this chaos, a new ideology was taking root, one that would transform scientific curiosity into an engine of destruction. Into this world was born Wernher von Braun in 1912, the son of aristocratic parents in what was then the German province of Posen. His mother, an amateur astronomer, gave him a telescope when he was young, and through it he glimpsed the moon and planets, sparking a fascination that would define his entire life. As a boy, he was more interested in the stars than his schoolwork. His grades in mathematics and physics were initially poor, not because he lacked intelligence, but because he hadn't yet found his purpose. That changed when he was 13 years old. His mother gave him a book that would alter the course of history. It was called The Rocket into Interplanetary Space, written by Hermann Oberth, a Romanian-German physicist who had been working on theoretical rocket science. The book wasn't easy reading for a teenager. It was filled with complex mathematical equations describing thrust, velocity, orbital mechanics, and propulsion systems. But young Wernher devoured it. The book described something that seemed like pure science fiction at the time, the idea that human beings could one day build machines powerful enough to escape Earth's gravity and travel to other worlds. Oberth laid out the physics of how it could work, using liquid fuel rockets instead of the solid fuel fireworks that had been around for centuries. He calculated the speeds needed to reach orbit, the fuel ratios required, the structural challenges of building something that could withstand the forces involved, and he made it all seem possible. Not in some distant future, but within the lifetime of anyone reading his book. Von Braun was electrified. Suddenly, mathematics and physics weren't abstract subjects taught in stuffy classrooms. They were the keys to the stars. He threw himself into his studies with obsessive focus. He worked through Oberth's equations again and again until he understood them completely. He taught himself advanced calculus and differential equations because he needed them to understand rocket trajectories. His grades transformed. The boy who had been failing mathematics was now at the top of his class. But understanding the theory wasn't enough for von Braun. He needed to see it work. At 17 years old, he conducted his first rocket experiment in the streets of Berlin. He took a toy wagon, the kind children pulled behind them, and he strapped 6 large fireworks to it. He lit the fuses and watched as the wagon shot down the street in a trail of smoke and sparks, crashing through a greengrocer's display and causing absolute chaos. The police were called. Von Braun was arrested. His father had to bail him out and pay for the damages. But von Braun had learned something crucial from that reckless experiment. Rockets worked. They produced thrust. They could move objects at incredible speeds. And if you could scale them up, make them powerful enough, you could send something or someone beyond the atmosphere. In his early 20s, von Braun joined the Society for Space Travel, a group of amateur rocket enthusiasts who met in Berlin to discuss theories and conduct experiments. They were dreamers and tinkerers, engineers and students, all united by the belief that humanity's destiny lay among the stars. They built small, liquid-fueled rockets in makeshift workshops and tested them in fields outside the city. Most of them exploded. Some barely got off the ground. But each failure taught them something new about combustion: fuel ratios, engine design, and structural integrity. The society operated in that brief window of time between the two world wars, when rocket science existed purely in the realm of exploration and wonder. There was no military application yet, no government funding, no weapons program. It was just a bunch of young people trying to make science fiction real, launching crude prototypes that sometimes flew a few hundred feet before falling back to Earth. They were building the future, one explosion at a time. But that innocent period of experimentation was about to end. In 1933, everything changed. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party seized power in Germany, ending the democratic Weimar Republic and establishing a totalitarian dictatorship. Within months, Hitler had dismantled all political opposition, consolidated absolute power, and begun implementing his horrifying vision for Germany. Jews were stripped of citizenship rights, communists and socialists were arrested and sent to concentration camps, books were burned, freedom of speech was eliminated, and Hitler began rebuilding the German military in direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler understood something that other leaders at the time did not fully grasp. The next war would not be won with the weapons of the last war. Trench warfare and traditional artillery had dominated World War I. But Hitler envisioned a new kind of conflict, faster, more mobile, more devastating. He wanted weapons that could strike at enemies from impossible distances, weapons against which there would be no defense. And that's when the German military became interested in von Braun and his rocket society. Army officers visited their testing grounds and watched their experiments. They saw the potential. Rockets, if they could be made large enough and powerful enough, could carry explosives hundreds of miles and hit targets with no warning. No bomber planes needed, no soldiers crossing enemy lines. Just a weapon launched from German soil that could rain destruction on cities far beyond the reach of conventional artillery. The German army offered von Braun and his colleagues a deal. Stop your amateur experiments and come work for us. We'll give you unlimited funding, state-of-the-art facilities, the best engineers in Germany, and all the resources you need to build rockets that actually work. In exchange, you'll build them for the military. You'll turn your dreams of spaceflight into weapons. Von Braun was 21 years old when he accepted. And this is where the moral complexity of his story truly begins. Did he have to say yes? No. Could he have refused? Technically, yes. But what would have happened if he had? By 1933, refusing the German military wasn't simply a career decision. It was a potentially life-threatening choice. People who opposed the Nazi regime were disappearing into concentration camps. Political dissidents were being murdered. The atmosphere in Germany was one of fear and conformity. And yet, it would be dishonest to say that von Braun only joined the military program out of fear. The truth is more complicated. He wanted to build rockets. That was his obsession, his purpose, the thing he had been working toward since he was 13 years old. The German military was offering him the chance to actually do it, to stop tinkering with toys and build real rockets that could reach the edge of space. For a young engineer consumed by ambition, it must have seemed like a dream come true. The fact that those rockets would be used as weapons, that they would kill people, seems to have been something von Braun was willing to rationalize or ignore. In his mind, perhaps, the ends justified the means. He would build the rockets, and after the war, whenever it came and however it ended, the technology would still exist. The knowledge would still be there. And someday, those rockets would carry people to the stars. It's the kind of moral compromise that seems impossible to justify from the outside, but which countless people throughout history have made when faced with the choice between their dreams and their principles. Von Braun chose his dream. The German military sent von Braun to a testing facility south of Berlin, where he was given a small team and told to start building. His first design was called the Aggregat 1, or A1 for short. It was a simple rocket, barely 3 feet tall, using liquid oxygen and alcohol as fuel. The design was elegant in theory, a combustion chamber at the bottom, fuel tanks in the middle, and a pointed nose cone at the top. In 1934, they rolled the A1 out to the launch pad for its first test. Von Braun and his small team stood at what they thought was a safe distance as the countdown began. The ignition sequence started, fuel flowed into the combustion chamber, the engine roared to life, and then the entire rocket exploded in a massive fireball that nearly killed everyone present. When the smoke cleared and they confirmed that everyone was alive, von Braun walked over to the smoldering wreckage, looked at the twisted metal, and said something that would define his entire approach to rocketry. "Well, at least we know it has energy." That was von Braun's philosophy. Failure wasn't something to be feared or avoided. It was data. Every explosion taught you something. Every malfunction revealed a design flaw. You didn't stop because something went wrong. You figured out why it went wrong, fixed it, and tried again. This willingness to push forward through failure, to learn from disaster, would become both his greatest strength and, later, one of his most disturbing characteristics. The A-2 rocket came next. Von Braun had learned from the A-1's catastrophic failure that the fuel tank design was flawed and that the engine needed better cooling. The A-2 was bigger, heavier, and more stable. In December 1934, they launched 2 of them, which they nicknamed Max and Moritz after characters from a German comic strip. Both rockets flew successfully, reaching an altitude of about 1.5 miles before falling back to Earth. It wasn't spaceflight yet. It wasn't even close, but it was progress. They had built something that flew in a controlled manner, that didn't immediately explode, that proved the basic principles of liquid-fueled rocketry could work. The German military was impressed. Von Braun was given more funding, more personnel, and orders to keep building. By 1937, the Nazi government had constructed a massive new rocket research facility on Peenemünde, an island on Germany's Baltic coast. It was isolated, secretive, and equipped with everything von Braun could possibly need. Testing stands for engines, wind tunnels for aerodynamic studies, machine shops with precision equipment, laboratories for fuel research, and a launch complex where they could fire rockets out over the ocean where failures wouldn't endanger populated areas. Von Braun was appointed technical director. He was only 25 years old, but he was now in charge of one of the most advanced weapons development programs in the world. His team grew to include hundreds of engineers, scientists, and technicians. The Nazi regime was pouring enormous resources into rocket development because Hitler believed correctly that these weapons would give Germany a decisive advantage in the war he was planning. And von Braun delivered. Working day and night, pushing his team to the limits of what was technically possible, he developed the A3, then the A4, refining the design with each iteration. The rockets grew larger, more powerful, more sophisticated. They developed gyroscopic guidance systems to keep the rockets stable during flight. They designed engine nozzles that could withstand temperatures hot enough to melt steel. They solved the problem of how to pump fuel into a combustion chamber fast enough to maintain thrust without the pumps destroying themselves. By the time World War II officially began in September 1939, von Braun's team was close to a breakthrough. They had most of the pieces figured out. They just needed to put it all together into one functional rocket that could do what Hitler wanted, carry a ton of explosives across hundreds of miles, and hit a target with reasonable accuracy. October 3rd, 1942. That was the day everything changed. The completed rocket stood 46 feet tall and weighed over 13 tons when fully fueled. Von Braun had designated it the A4, but Hitler would later rename it the V2, short for Vergeltungswaffe 2, meaning Vengeance Weapon 2. It was painted in a camouflage pattern and positioned vertically on the launch pad, white vapor streaming from the liquid oxygen tanks as they kept the fuel supercooled. The countdown reached 0. The engine ignited with a sound like the world splitting open. Flames shot out from the base of the rocket as it began to rise, slowly at first, then accelerating rapidly as it climbed into the sky. Von Braun and his team watched through telescopes as it disappeared into the clouds, still accelerating, still climbing. The rocket reached a maximum altitude of 53 miles, well beyond the internationally recognized boundary of space at 50 miles. When it came back down and crashed into the Baltic Sea, von Braun turned to his colleagues with tears in his eyes and said, "Today, the spaceship is born." In his mind, what they had just witnessed wasn't a weapons test. It was the first step toward his childhood dream of reaching the stars. The fact that this spaceship was designed to carry explosives and destroy cities seemed almost irrelevant to him compared to the technical achievement of what they'd accomplished. But the rest of the world didn't see a spaceship. They saw a weapon unlike anything that had ever existed. The V2 traveled faster than the speed of sound, which meant it hit its target before you could even hear it coming. There was no air raid siren that could warn people. No fighter planes that could shoot it down. No anti-aircraft guns that could target it. Once it was launched, there was absolutely nothing anyone could do to stop it. By 1943, Allied intelligence services had become aware of the V2 program. British reconnaissance planes photographed the Peenemünde facility, and spies on the ground sent reports about mysterious rocket tests on the Baltic coast. The Allies understood that if Germany could mass-produce these weapons and aim them accurately, they could fundamentally change the nature of the war. So they decided to destroy Peenemünde before that could happen. Operation Hydra was launched on the night of August 17, 1943. Nearly 600 British bombers flew over the Baltic and dropped thousands of tons of explosives on the research facility. The raid killed approximately 700 people, many of them engineers and scientists working on the rocket program. Buildings were obliterated. Testing equipment was destroyed. Years of research went up in flames. But von Braun survived. He had been in a shelter during the raid, and when he emerged to see the destruction, he immediately began salvaging what he could. He and his team dug through the rubble, recovering blueprints and documents, saving whatever pieces of equipment could be salvaged. When someone asked him if the program was finished, he replied, "They can't bomb the idea." And he was right. The Nazi leadership was too invested in the V2 to abandon it now. They needed a new production facility, somewhere that couldn't be bombed, somewhere hidden from Allied reconnaissance. And they found it in the Harz Mountains of central Germany, a massive network of underground tunnels that had been carved out of the rock. It was called Mittelwerk, and it would become the site of one of the most horrifying operations of World War II. This is the point in von Braun's story where it becomes impossible to see him as merely a scientist caught up in circumstances beyond his control. What happened at Mittelwerk reveals the true measure of his character and his willingness to achieve his goals regardless of the human cost. The Nazis didn't have enough German workers to staff the underground rocket factory, and even if they did, they didn't want to use them. So instead, they imported prisoners from concentration camps. 60,000 people were brought to Mittelwerk and the associated camp called Dora Mittelbau. They were Jews, political prisoners, Soviet prisoners of war, and anyone else the Nazi regime had decided to enslave. The conditions inside the tunnels were beyond comprehension. Prisoners worked 12-hour shifts in freezing cold, surrounded by toxic fumes from the rocket fuel. There was inadequate food, no medical care, and constant brutality from the SS guards. Men died from exhaustion, starvation, disease, and outright murder. When someone collapsed from weakness, they were beaten or shot. Bodies were removed from the tunnels and cremated in ovens that ran continuously. And von Braun knew. He wasn't some distant figure unaware of what was happening in his rocket factory. By this point in the war, he had been promoted to the rank of SS Sturmbannführer, a major in the SS, which was the most elite and ideologically committed branch of the Nazi Party. He toured the Mittelwerk facility regularly. He inspected the production lines. He spoke with the overseers. He saw the emaciated prisoners building his rockets. There are documented accounts of von Braun personally selecting skilled workers from among the concentration camp prisoners, pointing at men he wanted for specific technical tasks. He understood that these people were being worked to death. He understood that the tunnels were filled with human suffering, and he allowed it to continue because the rockets had to be built. By the end of the war, approximately 20,000 prisoners had died at Mittelwerk and Dora Mittelbau. 20,000 human beings worked to death or murdered outright in the production of the V2 rocket. More people died building the V2 than were killed by the V2 when it was used as a weapon. Starting in September 1944, the V2 attacks began. Over the next 7 months, more than 3,000 V2 rockets were launched at Allied cities. London was hit repeatedly, so was Antwerp, which was a crucial supply port for Allied forces. The Belgian cities of Liège and Hasselt were targeted. Parts of Paris were struck. The Dutch city of The Hague was devastated. The V2 was a weapon of terror. It gave no warning. People would be going about their daily lives, working, shopping, trying to survive in a war-torn city, and then suddenly there would be an explosion. Buildings collapsed. Streets were destroyed. Bodies were scattered. And there was nothing anyone could have done to prevent it because the rocket traveled so fast that by the time you heard the explosion, the attack was already over. The death toll from V2 attacks was approximately 9,000 people, the vast majority of them civilians. Every single one of those deaths can be traced back to the work that von Braun and his team accomplished at Peenemünde and Mittelwerk. He built the weapon. He knew what it would be used for. And he did it anyway because his obsession with rockets was greater than any moral consideration. By early 1945, it was obvious to everyone, except the most fanatical Nazis, that Germany was going to lose the war. The Allies were advancing from the west. The Soviets were advancing from the east. German cities were being bombed into rubble. The Third Reich was collapsing. Von Braun saw the writing on the wall, and he made a calculated decision about his future. His loyalty had never really been to Hitler or to Nazi ideology. His loyalty was to the rocket, to the dream of spaceflight, to the technology he had spent his entire adult life developing. And he knew that technology was valuable. Whoever controlled rocket technology after the war would control the future of military power. So von Braun began planning his defection. In April 1945, with Soviet forces closing in from the east and American forces from the west, he gathered his core team of engineers, about 120 of the most talented rocket scientists in Germany, and he led them south, away from the advancing armies. They brought V2 blueprints with them, hiding documents in mine shafts and abandoned buildings along the way. They brought technical drawings, test results, manufacturing specifications, everything needed to recreate the V2 program from scratch. On May 2nd, 1945, von Braun and his team encountered American soldiers near the Bavarian town of Reutte. Von Braun's brother Magnus, who spoke English, approached the Americans and said, "My name is Magnus von Braun. My brother invented the V2 rocket. We want to surrender to the Americans." Von Braun made it very clear to the American soldiers who he was and what he represented. He wasn't surrendering as a defeated enemy. He was offering himself as an asset. He knew the Americans would want the V2 technology, and he was willing to provide it in exchange for protection and the opportunity to continue his work. It was a job application disguised as a surrender. The Americans immediately understood the value of what had just fallen into their lap. The V2 rocket had terrorized London and Antwerp. It represented a technological leap that the United States hadn't matched. And more importantly, the Soviets were racing to capture as much German rocket technology as they could. If von Braun and his team ended up in Soviet hands, the balance of power in the post-war world could shift dramatically. This set in motion one of the most controversial operations in American history, Operation Paperclip. It was run by the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, which was essentially a precursor to the CIA. The mission was simple: recruit as many valuable German scientists and engineers as possible before the Soviets could get them. Bring them to America, give them new identities, put them to work for the US government. The name Paperclip came from the literal paperclips that were attached to the personnel files of these recruits. The paperclips held newly created documents that sanitized their Nazi backgrounds, covered up their war crimes, and presented them as apolitical scientists who had simply been caught up in the war through no fault of their own. Von Braun was the crown jewel of Operation Paperclip. By September 1945, he and his team were on a ship headed to the United States. They brought with them 100 disassembled V2 rockets that had been captured from German stockpiles, along with crates full of technical documents. Everything needed to rebuild the Nazi rocket program in America. The ethical questions surrounding Operation Paperclip are staggering. The United States had just fought a war against Nazi Germany, a war in which millions of people had been murdered in the Holocaust, in which concentration camps had been liberated, revealing horrors beyond imagination, in which the Nazis had been held up as the ultimate evil that had to be destroyed at any cost. American soldiers had died fighting that evil. And now, just months after the war ended, the US government was quietly bringing high-ranking Nazi officials to America, giving them jobs, paying them salaries, and protecting them from prosecution for their crimes. Von Braun wasn't just a Nazi party member. He was an SS officer who had been directly responsible for the deaths of thousands of people, both the prisoners who died building his rockets and the civilians who died when those rockets fell on their cities. The CIA and military intelligence agencies knew all of this. They had investigated von Braun's background. They had documentation of his SS membership and his role at Middlework, and they decided it didn't matter. The technology was too valuable. The Cold War was beginning, and the United States needed to beat the Soviets in the developing arms race. Moral considerations were secondary to strategic advantages. President Harry Truman had actually issued an order barring Nazis from entering the United States, but Operation Paperclip operatives simply worked around that order. They falsified records, omitted damaging information, and created cover stories that made von Braun and his colleagues look like innocent scientists who had been forced to work for the Nazi regime. When anyone asked uncomfortable questions, they were told these men were essential to national security. The first phase of von Braun's work in America began at White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. Starting in 1946, his team reassembled the captured V-2 rockets and began launching them, not as weapons, but as research tools. They strapped scientific instruments to the rockets, cameras, atmospheric sensors, radiation detectors, and sent them up to the edge of space to gather data. One of those launches in 1946 carried a camera that filmed the Earth from space for the first time in history. The grainy black and white footage showed the curvature of the planet, clouds flowing across the surface, the thin blue line of the atmosphere against the black of space. It was proof of what von Braun had always believed, that rockets could open up entirely new ways of seeing and understanding our world. But this wasn't the work von Braun had dreamed of. He wasn't building rockets to send people to space. He was launching captured Nazi weapons with scientific equipment bolted to them. It was a start, but it wasn't enough. He wanted to design new rockets, bigger rockets, rockets that could do more than just reach the edge of space and fall back down. In 1950, von Braun and his team were moved to Huntsville, Alabama, where they went to work for the U.S. Army at what would become the Redstone Arsenal. Here, von Braun finally got the opportunity to design a new rocket from scratch. The Redstone rocket was essentially an improved version of the V-2, using many of the same principles, but with better engines, better guidance systems, and better fuel efficiency. The Redstone would become America's first operational ballistic missile, and it would also be used to launch the first American satellite into orbit in 1958, in response to the Soviet Union's shocking launch of Sputnik the previous year. The DNA of the V-2 was still there in the Redstone's design, the same combustion chamber principles, the same fuel pump systems, the same basic aerodynamic shape. Von Braun had simply refined and improved what he had built for the Nazis. Meanwhile, the Cold War was intensifying. The Soviet Union, using their own captured German rocket scientists, had been developing their own ballistic missiles and space technology. On October 4th, 1957, they achieved something that sent shockwaves through the American government and public. They launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite, into orbit around Earth. The panic in the United States was immediate. If the Soviets could put a satellite into orbit, they could put a nuclear warhead into orbit. They could strike anywhere in the United States, with essentially no warning. The technological superiority that America had assumed after World War II suddenly seemed questionable. Politicians demanded answers, the military demanded solutions, and the public demanded that America catch up and overtake the Soviets in this new space race. Out of that panic, NASA was born on July 29th, 1958. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration absorbed various existing space and aeronautics programs, unified them under one civilian agency, and was given a clear mandate: beat the Soviets in space. And von Braun's team, with all their experience building and launching rockets, became a central part of NASA's operations. In 1960, von Braun was appointed director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville. He was now one of the most powerful figures in the American space program, overseeing the development of launch vehicles and propulsion systems. And he had a singular goal that he had been working toward his entire life. He wanted to build a rocket that could send human beings to the moon. This had always been von Braun's dream, even during the darkest days of World War II. When he surrendered to the Americans in 1945, he told his brother, "We knew that we could build a rocket that could go to the moon. We just needed someone who would let us try." Everything he had done, the weapons for Hitler, the concentration camp labor, the civilian deaths in von Braun's mind, it had all been in service of this ultimate goal. The moral atrocities were acceptable sacrifices on the path to achieving something transcendent. It's a horrifying calculus, but it seems to have been how von Braun genuinely thought. He was a man who had decided that the ends justified any means, that the dream of spaceflight was worth any price, even if that price was paid in thousands of human lives. He was, in the truest sense, a mad scientist, brilliant, driven, and utterly unmoored from normal ethical considerations. And now, finally, someone was going to let him try. On May 25th, 1961, President John F. Kennedy stood before a joint session of Congress and made an announcement that would define the next decade. "I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth." Kennedy's moon speech wasn't made in a vacuum. It was a calculated response to continued Soviet achievements in space. Just weeks earlier, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin had become the first human in space, orbiting the Earth and returning safely. Once again, the Soviets had beaten America to a major milestone. Kennedy needed something bold, something dramatic, something that would demonstrate American technological superiority and boost national morale. Landing on the moon was that something. It was audacious, expensive, and incredibly difficult. But Kennedy's advisors had consulted with NASA and determined it was achievable, provided the agency received massive funding and was given the authority to move quickly. And Kennedy's deadline before the decade was out meant they had less than 9 years to accomplish something that had never been done before. For von Braun, Kennedy's speech was the moment he had been waiting for his entire life. He finally had permission, funding, and a deadline to build the greatest rocket ever conceived. And, just like during the war, that deadline would give him permission to be ruthless, to push his team beyond normal limits, to take risks that would terrify more cautious engineers. Von Braun immediately began designing what would become the Saturn V, a rocket of almost incomprehensible scale and power. It would stand as tall as a 36-story building. It would weigh 6 million pounds when fully fueled. Its engines would generate 7.5 million pounds of thrust, at launch more power than 85 Hoover dams operating simultaneously. Nothing like it had ever been built before. The technical challenges were enormous. Von Braun essentially had to invent new engineering solutions for problems that had never been encountered before. How do you build fuel tanks that can hold hundreds of thousands of gallons of super-cooled liquid oxygen without cracking? How do you design engines that can operate continuously for minutes at temperatures hot enough to vaporize metal? How do you ensure that 3 massive rocket stages will separate cleanly while traveling thousands of miles per hour? How do you make it all safe enough that human beings can ride on top of it? Von Braun approached it the same way he had approached every engineering challenge since his days building the Aoni in Germany, through relentless testing, acceptance of failure, and learning from disaster. Engines exploded during tests. Components failed. Systems malfunctioned. And each time, von Braun and his team analyzed what went wrong, figured out how to fix it, and tried again. One of von Braun's most controversial decisions during the Saturn V development was something called all-up testing. Traditionally, complex rockets were tested in stages. You would thoroughly test the first stage on the ground, fix any problems, then test the second stage, and so on. Only after each individual stage had been proven would you stack them all together and attempt a full launch. It was cautious and methodical. Von Braun rejected that approach. He argued that Kennedy's deadline demanded speed. They didn't have time for years of incremental testing. Instead, he pushed NASA to do all-up testing, stack all 3 stages of the Saturn V together for the very first test launch, fuel it up, and just see what happens. It was the same philosophy he had used during World War II. In the war, we flew rockets before we understood them fully. This is no different. NASA officials were horrified. The risk seemed insane. If something went wrong during an all-up test, the entire rocket, representing millions of dollars and years of work, would be destroyed, and they might not even learn what caused the failure. But von Braun argued them down. He insisted that his experience gave him the judgment to know when they were ready. He said the deadline was more important than the risk. And he was right. On November 9, 1967, the first Saturn V lifted off from Cape Kennedy in Florida. It was the first time all 3 stages had been tested together. The sound was unlike anything anyone had ever experienced, a continuous roaring thunder that shook windows miles away and made the ground tremble. The rocket climbed perfectly. Stage 1 separated on schedule. Stage 2 ignited and continued the ascent. Stage 3 fired exactly as planned. It was a complete success on the first try. Over the next few years, 13 Saturn V rockets would launch. Not all of them were perfect. Apollo 6 experienced engine failures and dangerous vibrations. Apollo 13 suffered the catastrophic oxygen tank explosion that nearly killed its crew. But all 13 launches successfully got their payloads into space, and 6 of those rockets carried astronauts who would walk on the surface of the moon. Von Braun didn't design the lunar module or the spacesuits or the command module that brought the astronauts home. But he designed the thing that made it all possible, the rocket that could break free of Earth's gravity and send 12 tons of spacecraft on a trajectory to the moon. Without the Saturn V, there is no moon landing. And without von Braun's willingness to push engineering to its absolute limits, there is no Saturn V. After Apollo 11 successfully landed on the moon in July 1969, von Braun became a celebrity. He appeared on television shows, gave speeches, wrote articles about the future of space exploration. The American public had no idea or chose to forget that this man had built weapons of mass destruction for Adolf Hitler, that concentration camp prisoners had died by the thousands building his rockets, that he had been a member of the SS. Von Braun himself seemed to feel no guilt about any of it. When asked about his Nazi past in interviews, he would dismiss it as something he'd been forced into, a regrettable but unavoidable circumstance of being a young scientist in wartime Germany. He never acknowledged the deaths at Middlework. He never expressed remorse for the V2 attacks on civilian cities. In his mind, everything had led to this moment, human beings walking on the moon, and that achievement justified everything that came before. But von Braun's time at NASA didn't last much longer. After the Apollo program achieved its goal, public interest in space exploration began to wane. The government slashed NASA's budget. Plans for future moon missions were canceled. Von Braun wanted to use the Saturn V technology to build rockets that could send astronauts to Mars. NASA leadership wanted to focus on the space shuttle, a reusable vehicle that would never leave Earth's orbit but would be cheaper to operate. The bureaucratic battles frustrated von Braun. This wasn't what he had signed up for. He didn't want to build shuttles that went in circles around Earth. He wanted to build rockets that would take humanity to other planets. When it became clear that NASA had different priorities, von Braun retired in 1972. His health began failing not long after. Cancer, likely related to exposure to toxic rocket fuel over decades of testing, began spreading through his body. By 1977, Wernher von Braun was dead at the age of 65. The question of how to remember von Braun remains complicated and uncomfortable. He was undeniably brilliant. His contributions to rocketry and space exploration are immeasurable. Without his work, the moon landings might not have happened, at least not when they did. The technology he developed forms the foundation of modern spaceflight, but he was also complicit in some of the worst atrocities of World War II. 20,000 people died building his rockets in concentration camp conditions, while he held an SS rank and toured the facilities where they were dying. 9,000 people were killed when his V2 rockets fell on their cities. He knew what was happening. He saw it. And he decided his dream was more important than their lives. There's no simple moral conclusion here. Von Braun wasn't purely evil. The Nazis had plenty of people who were far worse, who took pleasure in cruelty and suffering. But he wasn't a hero either. He was a man who wanted something so badly that he was willing to accept any cost to achieve it, as long as someone else was paying that cost. In that sense, the moon landing itself becomes a more complicated achievement. Yes, it was an extraordinary demonstration of human ingenuity, courage, and determination. Yes, it expanded our understanding of the universe and inspired generations of scientists and explorers. But it was built on a foundation of Nazi war crimes, enabled by a government willing to overlook those crimes for strategic advantage, and led by a man whose moral compass pointed only toward his own ambitions. That's the truth about how we got to the moon. It's not the simple story of American heroism we like to tell ourselves. It's darker, stranger, and more morally ambiguous than that. But perhaps that makes it more human, because humans are complicated, capable of both extraordinary achievement and terrible compromise, sometimes in the same breath.